and welcome to the Property Trio. As always, I'm joined by my great two co-hosts, Mike Mortlock and Kate Bakos. How are you both today?
G'day, Dave. Good to see you.
Doing well, Dave. Looking forward to this one, and especially anytime you get to unleash in your special area of expertise, and I think this one's all about you today.
Well, it could be, but I'm the host, so I'm going to try not to talk too much and have you two in the hot seat. So
yeah, why not? It's a juicy one.
It is. So today's episode is a listener question, and it's somewhat of a cautionary tale that highlights a number of the major risks with property buying and investing. So Daniela has written to us saying, we bought a lemon in Perth as first home buyers. It was a house and land package and suffered with it for 9 years. Husband was transferred to Melbourne and we sold our family home and moved to Melbourne. We would like to buy our home in Melbourne, but the areas we like are quite prohibitive and we are renting at the moment. We currently live in an apartment building. Although it is stylish, we do not have enough space. So we downsized from a family home into an apartment. Not to mention the parking challenges, we have 2 cars and only one allocated parking spot. The only properties we can afford are within 700,000 to 800,000 price range, which pushes us to Mernda, Doreen, if we want a house, or we can buy 2 apartments, one for us and one for our son, but we would rent it out until he was ready. We're in our 50s and we feel we have missed the full cycle. First home, small, upgrade as kids grow, downsize when kids go to uni, get married. We shall be empty nesters in 5 to 7 years and we only have $110,000 in savings. What's worth having? 2 apartments or 1 family home with the hope one day it will increase in value so we can use the equity to buy some investment properties, apartments in CBD, in brackets. What should we look for first? Yeah. So, yeah, it's quite an in-depth. There's a lot that sort of happened historically, isn't there, guys? And then a number of questions to answer moving forward.
Yes.
There's a lot in it. And looking at the question from the form, it's kind of unravels even a little bit more, talking about the apartment that they live in compared to the ones available on the market. So there's plenty on the market, but the new developments are, nudging up to twice the value of what they could buy their apartment for. Obviously, it's not fit for purpose. They need a little bit more space and a car spot would work. But they're talking about, what should we buy if we're keeping it for 15 or 20? What should we buy if we're keeping it just for 10? Apartments, typically, she's heard they're not as good an investment, but they're outperforming houses at the moment. But, and talking about the difference between houses and apartments, she's saying the houses in her area are old and run down and the apartments are actually quite nice and stylish. I think, Kate, we've talked about this before, I'm pretty sure. Sorry, Dave.
So I was just going to let our listeners in on that's another whole section of sort of her questions and comments that you've just summarised, but we thought we wouldn't read it all out. But that's really helpfut background for us.
Good on you, Mike.
Sorry, I went off script.
You did.
For the first time ever. But Kate, we've talked about this before. Is that there are certainly pockets at the moment where units are outperforming houses, but for me it sort of seems a little bit more of a catch up. And there's also places in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, where the differential between house prices and unit prices has gotten so big that it's almost like sheer elasticity that has brought them together. So I don't think this trend of apartments outperforming houses is here to stay. I think it's just more of a balancing. What do you reckon?
Oh, look, I tend to slightly disagree. I think long term, the scarcity of a well-located house will hold people in good stead, but there's a price to be paid for that, and we don't have that luxury. So I'm looking at this scenario, and there's some really good questions, so I don't want to burn my powder, before we get to the comments, but this is a bit of a Swiss cheese situation. When you see those airline investigation shows, and I'm sorry to our our
Daniela.
listeners who have written in this question, and I'm referring it to it in this manner, but there's been a bit of bad luck here, is what I'm saying. And it's more than one round of bad luck. It's a few things.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at their age and their savings balance and their question, and I'm thinking to myself, let's focus on getting you a home that you can all exist in and not, have a difficult lifestyle and a life that you're not enjoying before we start thinking about investment, because we have a smaller amount of savings than I'd prefer to work with and less time on the timeline. So we have to think pragmatically, and I do have some good ideas. I will keep my powder dry, but I look at this, Mike, and I just think we're not really in a great position to be comparing houses with units and chasing capital growth. I think at the moment, getting the eye on the prize, we need to find a suitable home that won't go backwards in value for them.
Yeah, fair call.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really great sort of general overview and discussion to sort of set the scene for the rundown we've put together for this episode. And so I'll come back to that. So look, it really, I mean, this is a tough situation, and I'm sure we all really feel for our listener.
Yeah.
And anyone who is suffering from a dud property purchase. And as you both just sort of alluded to and just added a bit more flavour around, there are a number of elements that haven't gone Daniela and her husband's way here, such as the Perth property market, which they bought into 9-10 years ago. That was stagnant from 2006 until 2020. Having to sell after only 9 years of holding, which highlights the risk of cyclical market cycle risks. Moving from Perth to Melbourne, and Melbourne is a higher priced market, although the way Perth is going, it might catch it one day. And also the risk with buying off the plan and house and land packages in this situation, which Daniela describes as a lemon, which underperformed the market. And put that in perspective, that was a market that was going backwards already during that period of time. So let's start with the challenge of managing market cycle risk, Kate. Which, by the way, if for our listeners are really interested in deep diving into that, our podcast episode number 12 was property cycle management, and also episode 19 was time in the market versus timing the market. So, Kate, how has Daniela been exposed here to market cycle risk, and what are some ways to mitigate this challenge?
Yeah, they sold Perth. Now, it's hard because if you're standing at a poker machine and you're putting lots of money into it and it's not paying out, when do you cut your losses? The law of averages suggests that after a certain number of rounds you'll get lucky, and you should never apply that logic without a little bit of or without a lot of analysis to property markets. But if you look at history and look across our capital cities, or any city, but we've got a lot of data on capital cities, Perth did nothing for a long, long time. And we've talked on this show about Perth, and I've certainly been more prepared to give it a wide berth because of my active time in the property market and Perth being volatile or not doing anything. That's why I've felt that way about Perth. Maybe if I was in my 70s and I'd seen a couple of market cycles, I'd feel a bit differently. But unfortunately, they sold, and then Perth did something after they'd sold. Had they kept it and rented it out here, they wouldn't have been in this same position. But who was to know? If they'd known more about moving to Melbourne and they'd bought earlier, then it might have been a different scenario for them as well. So market timing is really hard. The best of us can't time a market, but what we do know is a long-term hold certainly smooths out the edges. And I bought in Tasmania years ago and people said, oh, you timed that well. I actually didn't. I bought in 2008 and I was pretty excited about it, but it had a run. And then it sat there and did nothing. And I knew from history that Hobart would bounce back at some stage. And it's a bit more volatile. It either does nothing for a long time or it's soaring. It doesn't tend to chug along. If you have a look at Melbourne, and I'm not talking Melbourne up over other capitals, but it's a little more consistent. It's got less dead flat sections in it for that period of time. So, every city has different growth drivers, but back to your question, Dave, in timing the market and only giving ownership a certain amount of time is risky. But to compound this, they bought new.
Yeah,
That's another segment. So I'll keep my powder dry for that
we
too.
will come to that. And so look, another risk that this situation highlights is the importance of being able to hold property long term and the risk of having to sell during a market dip if you don't have a long-term plan. So probably touched on some of this a little bit, but can you elaborate, Mike, on why this is important?
Yeah, look, it doesn't say the exact reason why it was a lemon or why they sold. Maybe it was costing them money to hold on to, so they were really kind of forced into a position, or maybe they just thought, like, 9 years it's done nothing, and I'm looking at other places around the country, we've got to get rid of this and try and go somewhere else because they don't have the advantage of time. But look, I think selling is always a bad thing unless it's part of the strategy. Obviously, you go through the accumulation phase and the consolidation phase, and eventually you need to sort of sell down so that you can use the money for your retirement or whatever it is you want to do. But you want that to be part of the strategy rather than I'm selling it because it didn't perform or I'm selling it because I didn't understand the cash flow. So, yeah, I mean, it's very easy for us to sit back now in hindsight and say, geez, even if it was a bit of a lemon, kind of anywhere in and around Perth probably would have done, 20, 30% over the last, 2 years. But it's, it's too easy for us to say that. But certainly I always kind of want people to sell property only because it's part of the strategy.
Yeah. I think she implies she sold it because they were moving to Melbourne, if she doesn't outright say it. But it's a really good point because also we do talk about, generally if you have to sell, you want to sell and buy simultaneously, essentially. And now she's, has had this space between getting out of the property market and one where the cycle actually turned, as you just touched on, Mike. And then that's potentially making it even harder for her to get into the Melbourne market now. So at Property Planning Australia, we discussed with our first-time buyers in particular the risk of purchasing in a different macro location, such as a city or a state, where you are compared to where you ultimately plan to live, and falling behind that marketplace. Now, Daniela, I probably didn't expect to move to Melbourne with her husband being transferred, but it's an example of this challenge when you own property as your first purchase in a different capital city to where you later decide to live. And so just a few numbers to illustrate this challenge with Perth versus Melbourne. So the current median value of houses in Melbourne is $941,000. In Perth, it's $750,000. For units in Melbourne, it's $613,000. Perth, it's $508,000. So they've moved and sold out of Perth, and trying to get into Melbourne is also more difficult because the average value is significantly higher. And just also over that last 10-year period, although Perth is obviously flying now and everyone, is well aware of Perth's huge increases in prices during the last few years, over the previous 10 years, Melbourne prices actually grew 96%, and Perth's prices from 2014 to 2024 have still only grown 8%. To put that in perspective, because of the large decline before the current upward trajectory. So, there's been a really big difference there, hasn't there? And it sort of explains why Perth's having such a big run at the moment to some degree. But Mike, how has moving from Perth to Melbourne impacted Daniela, and how could this potentially have been mitigated?
Well, to me, it sort of seems like the opposite of that phenomenon where people retire in Bali, right? They might have, modest nest egg, but they go to Bali and they're kind of like the lord of their own little principality, right? Going from Perth to Melbourne, it worked in reverse. Everything's a little bit more expensive, as you elucidated in those median house and unit comparisons. So, how could it be mitigated? I think you hit on it before. Ideally, you buy and sell at the same time. So they sold in Perth. I don't know what their situation was. Hopefully they could have recouped their deposit and perhaps put it into Melbourne as they went over there. But to me, it's not even a case of, okay, we sell in Perth and we buy in Melbourne. Ideally, they would have sold that property and put it into either a principal place of residence or an investment. So it could have really been mitigated by going, okay, we're going to Melbourne. We don't know exactly where we want to be, so we might rent, but to make sure that we are investing in the future and doing something with that money, we could have put that anywhere around the country. It doesn't have to be Victoria specific. And that's kind of where my head is at to some degree with the greater question as well. But like Kate, I'll keep my powder dry.
But, I don't know where they ultimately want to be. I mean, the inference is that they're planning to stay in Melbourne. Obviously, they're talking about kids and uni and marriage, so maybe they're expecting the kids will settle here. And to your point, Dave, if they're thinking that home is back in the West, I know that they've lucked out from a timing point of view, but if that's where they eventually want to wind up, I would consider getting something there, because if it continues to fly, they'll have regret big time.
I think that's a really great point, Kate.
Yeah, we never know where our kids are going to go. I mean, so many people that want to get a unit for their kids for when they go to uni. Who knows if they'll go to uni or where they'll go? I've got a year 12 who's only 6 months off getting her final score, and I still don't know where she'll go. She's got regional unis as options as well. She talks about chasing the sun in Brisbane. She could go overseas and nanny and decide she wants to learn the language and study abroad. I don't know. None of us really know. So I've got more answers around that point. But I think they have to ask themselves carefully, where are we most likely to wind up and want to retire? Because that's where I'd be chasing. And I know that a lot of people...
if they're sorry to jump in there, but if they're unsure, that's where which we'll come to and talk about a bit more, but they should consider rent vesting, which sort of goes to both of what you two have just been saying.
Yeah, a lot of people are nervous about rent vesting, and sometimes I find I don't want to sound ageist, it can be an age thing. These guys are kind of my vintage, so I'm not going to tie them with that. But my mum and dad, they would never rent in a million years, probably not even for a week. Like, they've just got this thought in their head. So I'm always cognizant of that. There are some barriers you can't break down, but if Melbourne's not the future forever home, I would definitely circle in on rent vesting. Yeah.
And we might unpack that a bit more in a second. So, Kate, Daniela's predicament also highlights the risk with house and land packages and buying off the plan, which we have covered in episodes for our listeners to go back if they want to dig into depth in this area. Episodes 58, 59 and 174.
Yes.
Do you want to provide a general synopsis on why these properties are often higher risk of underperforming over time?
Yeah, I'd love to. I was presenting last night. I was on a panel and I answered this question, and I'm sorry to the house and land person in the audience I offended. I didn't mean offence, I just meant education. So I'll try and coach this in the best way I can. It's all about the land to asset ratio. And you also pepper in a little bit of developer or builder margin or introduce a margin, and you can add fuel to the fire. So when you buy something brand new, when you buy any property, there's usually two components to it unless you're buying land. There's the house or the dwelling portion, and then there's the land portion. Even if it's an apartment, there's a land portion. It might be, 1/400th of the value of the land that the whole block's built on, and that belongs to your unit, or it's a portion to your unit. But I digress. If your dwelling value is higher than your land value, knowing that dwellings depreciate and land appreciates, then the appreciating portion might not be appreciating at the same pace as the depreciating portion. So if your overwhelming force on that property is in negative territory, you're losing more value than you're making, you find yourself in negative territory. And that's, dare I say, what's happened with this house and land. Now, what I don't know is whether there were any developer or introducer or builder or salesperson margins. I'm assuming that there probably were, and that erodes your value as well, because if you pay $500,000 for something that a salesperson picks up 20 or 30 grand on, then you're paying 500 for a 470 property, which, I'm just using round figures here. That's why we steer clear of brand new off the plan and house and land. And if I had to categorise the risk rating on these things, I'd say off the plan high rise is even more scary than a house and land. And I have seen reasonable land to asset ratios on certain house and land packages. I've seen it done, but with construction costs where they're at, you're paying top dollar for something that, is driving out of the lot. So that's one thing that I'm concerned about. And I'll go one step further and just reference what Danielle said at the start of her journey. The only properties we can afford should be within $700,000 to $800,000 range, which pushes us to Manda or Doreen if we want a house. I'm a bit worried about that comment. It feels like they're making the same mistake. They're just going straight back into Greenfields territory and looking for something shiny and new. And I want to say, if you can resist doing that and get something that's dated and established, that you can add a little bit of value, even just with a repaint. You don't need to have the circa 2015 or 2020 or 2024 house, because you'll be paying a lot more money for that dwelling and eroding your options for selecting something that will deliver you some capital growth.
Yeah, 100%. And another way for Daniela to think about it, because she also has made reference at one point of, apartment in the CBD as well. And so understanding the supply and demand curve, often where there's house and land packages or where there's high-rise apartments, there's a proliferation of supply. So lots and lots of houses that are the same, or lots and lots of apartments that are the same, Daniela. And that's one of the other factors that's putting downward pressure on these on new properties, because they're often located in and around areas where there's lots of other properties available, lots of other land, or lots more apartments that can go up in the sky as soon as the apartments that are there are all full. So that's another factor to consider. Another thing just to think of is, look, a new apartment or a new house is a bit like putting a new car on top of a piece of land. Okay, and so Daniela, that house is the new car, and it's going backwards in value rapidly because of all the bits and pieces that goes into building it. They're going backwards in value. And one of the ways I like to break that down for people to try and understand is just think, what's the value of a new door handle once it's out of its packet? What's the value of an oven the first time you use it? And that goes for every piece of a new house. And as Kate alluded to, there's also a profit being paid to the developer who sold it, and also the builder and developer who have built it as well. So you're paying much more than the actual value of the materials. So there's a range of reasons why often, particularly in the early years, a new purchase won't show the capital growth of an established property. And when I say early years, that can be 3 to 5 years, but that can be 7 to 10 years. So another little rule of thumb is you ideally often don't want to be the first person who owned a property.
Yep.
Unless you're building your own home for pure lifestyle purposes. Yeah. Okay, so your stage of life is also an important consideration when it comes to developing your own property plan. Obviously, I'm the property planner on this podcast, Mike, but you certainly fully appreciate the importance of having a plan and regularly use your analogy of eating your vegetables, which is the metaphor for doing your property plan before having the main course and dessert, which is buying the property. What could Daniela consider when trying to work out the next steps for their investment or home buying strategy before making the decision, given they are in their 50s and may only be 10 to 15 years away from retirement, and they've also shared how their son could be moving out of home within the next 5 to 7 years?
Yeah, look, I think Kate sort of talked about the son side of things. I don't like the idea of, buying an apartment for them, buying one for the son. I think, they still do have time. They're going to be alive for a number of decades to go, right? But I think it's important that they get their strategy right and get clear on it, because they're talking about a lot of different things, going out to Doreen, buying an apartment in the city, buying 2 apartments or buying a house. I think the vegetables are the most important thing here, and, they shouldn't get distracted by the dessert of, the off the plan apartment in the city or, shiny things. I think they've got to get really, really clear on the strategy. They might kind of want the idea of having a home to call their own, but in essence, they need to get serious about their investment and what they can actually achieve for themselves in the short time. So I would, if it was me, I would be coming up with the plan and sticking to it and not getting distracted on it. And I think that there's two different ways to occupy a dwelling. You can live in it or you can own it. And I think if they want to be in the city and the CBD, rent it, right? Make someone else carry the loss or the cash flow negativity or the lack of growth, and use their investment capital. And it could go a little bit further if they're not piling a bunch of money into their principal place of residence, if they're rent vesting, to find the best fundamentals for them. I don't like the idea of bringing sort of the sun's trajectory in the mix with the apartment and sort of swapping between strategies. I think, like Kate said in the beginning, they need a place that's fit for purpose. They don't have enough space. They got 2 cars. They got 1 car space. Find what looks like a good place for them. I would be looking at renting it. Obviously, there's some issues around the rental market as well, but hopefully they can find a location that's suitable for them, and then they can get really serious on that strategy. And I think they really need to get an investment property that's going to give them that growth, to give them the options if they do want to maybe dispose of that and buy a principal place of residence down the track, or just basically end up in a better financial position than they are right now.
I absolutely agree with Mike. And there's something that I want to add here, because I feel like they're circling the apartment idea because they've picked up on units outpacing houses. And I want to be very, very clear that unit is a very broad genre, and that you've got apartments, townhouses, villas. There's a lot of stuff in that unit bucket, and circling a CBD apartment, it's making me feel very, very nervous. Out of all of those potential pieces of the puzzle in that bucket, they've probably chosen the riskiest one. And I think that if the lifestyle that they're wanting is a certain, inner ring or a certain suburb, they should probably think about what could work for them long term with maybe a different kind of unit, whether it's a townhouse or a big villa. You can get 3-bedroom villas. And might I add, you can get 3-bedroom apartments, nice big old ones in boutique blocks in some really charming pockets around the city, not in the city. And you don't pay that same premium. So for anyone that's listening thinking, why aren't Kate and Mike giving us some gold here because we like this scenario, it's resonating? Well, I would be circling some of those inner and middle ring areas for some established older style apartment blocks that do offer 3-bedders. They are rare, but you can come across them, and you can still purchase them in Melbourne for under $700,000. You can have your 3-bedroom. Then you don't have to be worrying about whether you should be buying 2 and earmarking 1 for your son, etc. But back to the point, for Danielle, they absolutely need a strategy before they start circling in on dwelling types and areas.
Yeah, and look, as we've touched on briefly, but their viable third option, which Daniela could consider, is rent vesting. That way they're able to rent in the meantime in the location they would like to live in, and have the potential to purchase this quality investment for 700 to 800K, whether it's a house, whether it's a 3-bedroom townhouse or established apartment.
Yeah.
Mike, could this be a potential strategy for Daniela?
I think so, absolutely. I wanted to highlight a little bit of data that we've recently crunched. We looked at the 28 days sort of between mid-April and mid-May in Victoria, and we found that if you annualise this over the year, Victoria has about 46,000 rental properties for sale. And if you look at the lending indicators, we've got 40,000 coming online. So, if you look at the ABS stats on population growth in Victoria to September 2023, Victoria grew by 2.9%, but their rental stock is actually projected to shrink by 1% according to that data. So that is a bigger subject. It's another episode, but to me, that's the story of the Victorian land tax changes. And the net result, no matter...
So what does that mean in just simple terms for our listeners?
It means it's going to be harder for renters. On the other side of the coin, Yeah, it represents an
available.
opportunity for investors, but
Yeah.
it just kind of depends. If they feel like they're at the price point and the locations that they are looking at, they will be able to secure a rental, then I think rent vesting is the obvious strategy. If they are looking at investing in Victoria, then they can potentially be purchasing one of those sort of middle ring established apartment style properties that Kate was talking about, because that's more likely to be at a price point that they can afford than a house. And they certainly have observed that trend in units outperforming houses. I mentioned before that I don't expect that to continue heading that way, but a well-located area and one of those pretty little hamlets and an established apartment, not a new apartment, is likely to be a reasonable investment. But the benefit on rent vesting is that they don't have to confine themselves to Melbourne or Victoria. They can look at the whole country. So they can actually go, all right, we've found a nice place that we can rent. It's a little bit bigger. We got 2 car spaces. It's closer to the city, closer to our son. You know, the amenities rather than, say, Doreen, and I'm not familiar with it, but I think it's a bit of a commute. And then they can look at the whole map of Australia and buy on the best fundamentals, the best property investment for them. And that might be in Victoria or it might not.
Yeah, and it also allows them to get into a high quality property in a well located suburb or part of whether it's a major regional centre or a capital city, that might be more affordable as well. So if 700 to 800 is their budget, they potentially can get a better quality asset than they might be able to get into in Melbourne.
I can think of some good ones in Melbourne in that price point, though.
Yeah, and there are good options in Melbourne
Yeah.
as well, but possibly, as you were touching on, not a house. It might
No,
be
definitely
a
a
townhouse,
house. Yeah.
and even a house.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And on Melbourne, perhaps we wouldn't have said this 12 or 24 months ago, but I'm starting to notice and certainly feel myself that the opportunities in Victoria are there. There aren't really the green shoots that people like to see there yet. We kind of talk about it in the market update, the last couple where Kate's like, it's coming, like I can see it on the ground. I think these land tax changes have been priced in. I think maybe in time they could be repealed, and that's likely to put a fire under the market, but it is kind of forecasted in the Victorian budget for a couple of years. So that's a bit of a long shot, but it's just, it's really kind of at the bottom of the cycle, and everything that I was talking to about that rental stress feeds into a property investor. So, I know I said find a rental and you can look at anywhere in the whole country. I actually think Victoria has a lot of good prospects right now, and Melbourne specifically.
Yeah, it certainly does. There's a lot of key data points that are flashing green or flashing red. But as we touched on, I think it might not start to flow through into actual numbers in terms of property growth for 12 months, 18 months. But, that possibly now is the time to get in. Look, I think, yeah.
If they're focusing on Melbourne as their forever location, one silver lining to this dilemma is that the market has stood still for them. Show me another capital city other than Hobart that's done that. None of them have offered that. So you can look in the rearview mirror and be feeling sad about what you've missed out on and what's not gone your way. But if you're looking forward and Melbourne's where you want it to be, they have held back the tide for you. And that's not something that you see often. I haven't seen Melbourne flatline like this for quite a while.
Yeah, I think Daniela and her husband need to sit down together and have a good chat and ask themselves where they see themselves living in 5, 10 and 15 years. And if that's a bit of a blurry picture and they can't be certain whether, ultimately they might stay in Melbourne, they might head back to Perth or go somewhere else, then I think they really seriously need to consider rent vesting, working out where they'd like to live based on where they're working, their son's at school, what's affordable for them from a rental perspective or what they would be paying, and then what they can put into the property market.
Yes.
And then from there, it really is a matter of deciding, well, is that Melbourne or is it some other location in the country, and making that decision. So I think it starts with, can they see themselves living in Melbourne for, probably at least 10 years? And if they can't, then it's probably the rent vesting pathway for them. Is there anything, before we go into our gold nuggets, is there anything else either of you two would like to add?
Yeah, one more little thing. If they've had this advice and they've decided on where they want to be, wherever that is, and they've mentioned in their cover note, they'd like to use the equity to buy some investment properties going forward, we've got to look at the timeline and ask whether that's feasible. And there's always a why. Why do you want to invest? Is it because you'd like to build more wealth? Is it because you haven't built any wealth yet and this is your vehicle? Or is there another way that you could build wealth upon retirement? And that all comes down to having a plan and talking to someone licensed. But I look at this scenario, and if they haven't got the nest egg that they want, I think that they need to contemplate getting something and holding it for however many years this might be, 10, 15, until they're empty nesters, and they then decide where they could comfortably go for a lesser price. They could then trigger a sale, have some profit left over, and maybe pop that into a different asset class rather than betting the farm. We've also got to take into account, by the time that happens, will they still be working? What will they be earning? And what will a lender's attitude towards them borrowing for an investment property look like? So this requires advice. It really does. And sometimes people confuse having a roof over their head with building wealth, and other times it can be done in tandem. But I really do want to stress that this situation really does deserve professional advice.
Yeah, I actually also think, I don't know if we've touched on it explicitly, but I think to a question of whether she should be buying like 2 apartments or 1 property, I just am not sure with a budget of 700,000 to 800,000 you can get 2 quality, say, apartments with that sort of budget. So I'd be more inclined to be putting that money into 1 better quality investment rather than spread across 2.
Me too, on that note.
Mike, any last words before we go into our gold nuggets?
I think I'll save it for the nugget, because then I've got less work to do.
Good thinking.
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
My gold nugget is to not kind of pervert the course of what you're trying to achieve with other kind of dual ambitions. What I mean by that is often people will go, oh, well, I'm going to buy an investment property here because I want to live in that location, or I'm going to buy it and I'm going to rent it out and then I'm going to move in. Because what you're basically saying is that I'm prepared to sacrifice on my performance to secure this asset for a future date. Now, if that asset is not investment grade stock and it's more about, just grabbing it now while you can, you're kind of limiting your potential. Because let's say you buy a property in the Sunshine Coast because you want to retire there. Now, is that going to be the best performing market over the next 5 or 10 years while you sit there and hold on to it? Chances are probably not, right? We don't often get those things aligned. And the same is true in this particular situation where they, thinking about buying an apartment for maybe themselves or buying it for their son. If they want to provide something for their son, a bit of a head start to buy his first home or something like that, then they're better off just chasing the best investment and the best performance than trying to kind of pervert the strategy by trying to kill 2 birds with 1 stone.
My gold nugget relates to when you're triggering a sale event, because you can look at how your property is tracking on paper and be upset when it's not going so well or be excited when it's soaring, but it's not until you actually sell that you lock in that result. And knowing that they were selling at a loss, they'd called it a lemon, I would have encouraged them to seek advice on that sale. And their advisor might have said, yes, this one is a dud, but we recommend that you purchase back in this market and hold it, a foot on that particular ladder. I think it's worth getting professional advice before you trigger a loss. In fact, it's worth triggering advice before you sell, even when you're looking at a gain. And I'm not sure whether they did or not, but I would have had advice around making sure I was active in the market and buying at a very similar time to selling.
Yeah, look, 2 great gold nuggets there from you guys. And
we try.
We certainly unpacked a lot there for Daniela and for our listeners on a lot of different subjects. So hopefully Daniela and her husband are get a lot out of that episode. And
And thank you for being courageous and sharing all of that with us. We do feel for you. And we do hope that this has really helped you out, and ask us any further questions if you've got them.
100%.
Yes, please do. And wishing you all the best.
Absolutely. So until next week, hopefully, Mike, your legs aren't too sore, and
Good luck on the charity ride, Mike.
you've got thick bike shorts on your butt, so it's not too much chafing.
Gosh.
Thanks, Dave. Let's leave my
Open
posterior.
Pandora's
What have you got?
box.
4 days on the bike, 150 kilometres a day.
4 days, 500 Ks.
All the
It's
best,
going to
mate.
sting, but it's for a good cause. So
And we're seeing you at the
I'm ready to
People
go.
Awards night. I love your stamina. You're a very good guy.
I've got to present an award, so might be sitting down for that one.
It's all right. I'll have your drink waiting for you.
Good.
All right.
I'll see you guys
See you
next
next
week.
week.
See ya.
Bye.